Welcome back to the channel. My name is Lauren if you're new here. If you have already hit that subscribe button, thank you. You're the best. I really appreciate it. We are talking eyeshadow palettes today. I actually miss talking about eyeshadow palettes. I feel like for months, it was every week there was a new eyeshadow palette coming out that I wanted to review. There were so many great ones. And not so much lately, which is the best for my wallet. But I still wanted to talk about eyeshadow palettes today, and I thought, what better time to bring up my favorite spring palettes than in spring? Yes, it is spring, believe it or not. Sometimes I don't believe it because it's cold and I get chilly, but you know what? My eyeshadow still needs to be spring-like right now, okay? And I have a lot of good palettes that feel like spring to me. Now, this is really just my opinion. For me personally, I know a lot of people love pastels for spring. I do not. I've never been a big pastel person. It just hasn't been my thing. I just don't like how most pastel eyeshadows perform. They're just very light. They kind of disappear into my skin after a couple hours. So most of these are not pastel palettes, though you will see some pastel leaning colors. I'm not gonna lie. There's some in there. There's some good pastels that work, but I don't love them. They're not my favorite. But enough with me talking about pastels. Let's get into the top 10 palettes that I have picked out that just scream spring to me. Now, I will admit, I am definitely in a little bit of a purple era. You're gonna see a lot of purples. I've just been loving purples a lot right now, so be prepared to be purpleized. But let's get into this. There's no order whatsoever to how I show these palettes. And it's a pretty good mix of indie and mainstream brands. So we got a little bit of everything in here, which is kind of exciting. So I think I'm gonna start with the one that was the most surprising pick for me, because a lot of people did not like this palette, but I actually really like it. And I think it just reminds me of spring. That's the Pat McGrath and Bridgerton palette. This is the Diamond of the First Water palette. And this is just like a great spring palette. I'm trying not to blind you, sorry. It's just the great lighter colors, a little more neutral, but you've got that light blue, which is really pretty. You've got some really nice pinks in here as well. Now, I very rarely recommend Pat McGrath. I think it's very expensive, almost too much for what you're getting. That's just my opinion though. You may have seen me tear apart the Bridgerton Pat McGrath face palette. If you haven't, I'll link it up here. That packaging was terrible, but I just feel like this palette was really good. It's really simple, really easy to use, but all the eyeshadows worked really well in it. And I just thought you could create so many beautiful springy looks with this palette. So that is the first palette that we were talking about. Next up, this is the Two Moods palette from Give Me Glow, one of my favorite indie brands. I don't love the packaging, partly because it's kind of hard to show off, but this is the palette. They split it into two sides for two moods. You've got the peachy pinkier side, and then you have the more purple side, which you know I love. But even though I love the purple so much, the pinks and the like peachy colors are actually really good on this. I love Give Me Glow's formula. I think they do an amazing job, and I don't know if this is still available anymore, but it is such a good, fun palette, and their shimmers are just like mind-blowing. And it's just like, you know, it reminds me of flowers. Kind of like the cover where you've got like blooming flowers and you've got butterflies on there. It just really reminded me of just a spring garden. I really like this palette. Next up, another fantastic indie brand, Blend Bunny Cosmetics. And we're talking about the Sickly Sweet palette. This is probably gonna be the best instance of a pastel palette that I will bring up during this video, because again, I don't love pastels, but I feel like the pastels in this palette in particular are just pigmented so perfectly. It's just the right amount of pigment. With a lot of pastels, I feel like they're almost see-through, like you can see your eyes underneath the eyeshadow because it's so light. I don't feel like that for the most part with this one. Not gonna lie, the first couple rows, some of those colors I cannot use because they almost are non-existent on me. But the bottom three rows, they're still pastel leaning, but they have so much pigment in them that they just look beautiful. And of course, The shimmers are fantastic. I just think this is like the epitome of spring. It really is. It's great for any use, and it's just, I love using it. Blend Buddy has the best formula. The color that really just screams spring to me is more of a, what color is this? Just like a lighter green, like a lighter, more earth toned green, but not pastel. Don't give me too many pastels. But the green I'm talking about is one that lives in this next palette. This is the Nouveau palette from Anastasia Beverly Hills. And I love this green. I actually love all the greens in here. I have to be careful because a couple of the shadows are broken in here. But it's this green in the corner. Oh, that like just pretty kind of like light olivey green. Like what color is that? Mossy green? That is just a beautiful green that I absolutely love. But I also love this palette just in general for spring. I think there's some great lighter, more neutral colors, but the greens just remind me of kind of like, again, like new growth. You know, the sun is out, things are growing, things are starting to become green again, and it just, you know, makes me happy. This formula is also fantastic. Mine is breaking a little bit, so I need to be really careful. I'm going to put this down, but I like that there's depth in this palette as well. You have the darker greens if you want to darken up a look. It doesn't have to be all light and bright. It can be a little bit more moody. Another palette with a kind of a similar color scheme that I really like is the Natasha Denona Retro Glam palette. Now, again, you are seeing just a lot of those greens that I just talked about. Like they're not pastel, but they're definitely a lighter, mossier kind of green. And that's just my favorite green for spring. I think it's fantastic. And I think this palette is fantastic. A lot of people had commentary about how a lot of the greens look the same. I don't think they were wrong. There are definitely some greens that I think could have been a little bit different in this palette, but overall I like it. Again, there is a lot of depth in this palette. You're not just going to create kind of like one color story. You can darken up the look, deepen it up. There's some dark greens in here that are beautiful. This is a fantastic spring palette. Next up, we have another indie brand, and this is the SOLMÅNE 2 eyeshadow palette from Oden's Eye. And I actually think this might be my favorite eyeshadow palette from Oden's Eye, period. I've tried the majority of them, but this one is actually on my eyes. This one, I just thought the colors are definitely a little bit more pastel leaning, but they're also very bright. So they have a lot of pigmentation in them. You can go a little more the pastel route. That's kind of what I did for today's look. But I just thought that the mattes in this palette work so well with each other. They layer on top of each other beautifully. They just like have a lot of intensity to them that you don't always see with like pastel colors. And again, they just play really well with each other, which, you know, can go wrong real fast if you're layering a bunch of colors on top of each other, but I've never had that problem. Again, you have the darker colors if you do want to create something a little more darker, deeper, moodier. That is not a problem with this palette. The shimmers are okay. They're not my favorite, in my opinion. I think it's really the mattes that shine in this palette. I just think they're fantastic. So yeah, another fun one to play with. Plus, this color, this teal, Neptune, so pretty. So pretty. This one, I know I'm gonna get people that say it's more of a summer palette. I don't think it is. I don't think it is. This is the Barbie and ColourPop collab. This is the Malibu Barbie palette. I talk a lot about this palette, I feel, because it's really good. I feel like it kind of was released, no one noticed it, and it was a shame because I felt like the colors in this palette just perform so well. You might be able to call it a summer palette if you really wanted to. It's got a lot of bright colors, but I feel like with the amount of neutral colors in here, it takes it down a notch to spring. Yes, the sun is out, it's shining, you're finally able to stand by the ocean, probably not in your swimsuit, but at least look at the ocean and enjoy a little bit of warm weather. And it's really good. The shimmers in this are fantastic. ColourPop, I feel like their formula varies from palette to palette, but they have a particular formula that's fantastic that I think they used in this one. Everything works well, it blends out beautifully, it's bright, it's happy, it's the beginning of spring. Typically when I do these videos, I don't like to use too many palettes from the same brand, but I had to use this one. So this is another one from Gimme Glow. This is the Butterfly Vibes palette. I'm not quite sure what Gimme Glow is up to. They're doing a rebrand right now. They're kind of selling out of everything that they've put out before, but this palette came out when they were changing things up, so it looks much different than the Two Moods palette, but I still think the formula in this is great. Yes, one thing it's lacking is shimmers. It needs more shimmers. Luckily though, their mattes are fantastic. They're pigmented, they're easy to blend out, they look so good, and they're bright and vivid. But again, I feel like this palette has a lot of variety in it. Not a whole lot of depth. You only have really one darker color. It's that dark brown there. So you can deepen up a look with the brown if you want, but you're gonna get a primarily lighter look with this palette. But that's okay, because that's kind of springy, right? You have some more pastel leaning colors, but again, because the mattes are so pigmented, I don't have to worry about the colors looking transparent on my eyelids. Like, they have depth to them. They're deep enough for that, like, you can see the color. The color in the pan is the color you get on your eyes. This is such a great palette. I mean, I feel like people didn't give them enough credit for like trying something new. People were mad that the pan sizes were different, but I really enjoy this palette and I think it's fantastic for spring. This next palette was actually a part of my project pan last year, and a lot of the times when I'm doing a project pan, okay, I'm only on my second project pan, but sometimes I'll get sick of something, and I never got sick of this palette. This is actually, oh my god, it's another ABH one, but this is from the Noir line. This is the Pro Pigment Palette Volume 5, and you're gonna see why I like it. It's purple. It's purple. Purple is just such a spring color to me. I don't know if it's because there's a lot of purple flowers out and around my neighborhood. I don't know if it's just I am just drawn to purples in general, but they just remind me of spring. And again, we're dealing with a palette that has a lot of depth. It's got some neutrals, it's got a ton of purples, which I love, and it's got some darker colors if you want to deepen up the look. I have so much fun with this palette. I just think it's fantastic. The shimmers are great. I don't mess with the pressed glitters in here, but yeah, it's there in case you want it. And it's just, again, I feel like it's kind of an underrated palette because it's really, really good. And no one seems to talk about it anymore, but I am still very actively using this palette because the purple pigmentation is so good. Last on my list, I have been using this palette so much lately. It's one of the newer ones in my collection, but this is from Ensley Rain Cosmetics, and this is the Lands of Enchantment palette. And I just love the outer packaging, and I love that the color story within matches the outer packaging. You know, like you can see those colors in this palette. Again, we're talking about a palette that is verging on pastel. You could probably get away with calling it pastel, but it's not. There's like a lot of depth to this palette. You've got a lot of color variations. Yes, you do have some colors that are pastel, I would say that. And some don't work for me. They're a little bit too light. But for the most part, the majority of them do work. And it's really the shimmers that blow you away. Every time I use a shimmer from this palette, I get a compliment from a random stranger on the street because it's so shimmery and beautiful and blends out and stays on your eyes. Like, I don't know how they do their shimmer formula, but it is really fantastic. I just have a lot of fun with this palette. It's fun to play around with. It's got, again, some of those lighter colors. You know, spring is blooming. The flowers are now coming up. They're a little bit lighter, but then again, you got some brighter colors in there as well. So you don't have to go too pastel-y if you don't want to. I just feel like there's a lot you can do with this palette, and I always have a lot of fun when I use it. So I had to include it as kind of my #1 palette right now for spring. And those are my top 10 palettes from spring. Some of them are older, some of them are newer, some are indie, some are mainstream. We were kind of all over the place, but I feel like there's so many great palettes that really represent the idea of spring to me. And all these palettes are that idea, you know? It's really just kind of the beginning of the sun coming out, things warming up, flowers blooming again, everything kind of starting anew after the winter. And these are just fantastic palettes in themselves. Like, they're just great formulas, easy to use, fun to use, and just the most beautiful colors that remind me of spring. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit that subscribe button. It would mean the world to me. And I'm off to eat lunch, but I will see you all in my next video. Bye!